Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcast. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on the Wabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. And welcome back to Second World War links between Newcastle and Portuguese Timor, a forgotten story, presented by Dr Jude Conway. In part 1, we explored a dramatic and often overlooked chapter of World War II history, when Australian and Dutch forces invaded neutral Portuguese Timor in late 1941, fearing Japanese control of the island. What followed was a year of daring guerrilla warfare, led in part by Novocastrian Commando Captain Jeff Laidlaw, and sustained through the courageous support of the local Timorese villagers and the Portuguese. We learned how, under threat of Japanese reprisals, hundreds of civilians, priests, nuns, wounded fighters and families were evacuated to Australia, to a remote military site at Bob's Farm, just outside of Newcastle, where a new chapter began. Now, in part 2, we turn to the untold story of what happened next. Who were these evacuees? How did the Australian military and local communities respond? And what tensions and alliances emerged in this unlikely wartime refuge? Join us as we uncover the extraordinary events at Bob's Farm camp, where race, politics and humanity collided in unexpected and lasting ways.
The White Australia policy, which restricted residence in the country to people of European descent, was forced into a hiatus during the war as thousands of coloured people, as they were called at the time, gained temporary residence. Asian seamen stranded in Australian ports, Indonesians evacuated alongside Dutch from the Netherlands East Indies, and Chinese evacuated from New Guinea. Despite Callinan's preference for pure-blood Portuguese, many mestizos and Timorese were brought to Australia from Portuguese Timor. The army had brought them over, so the army had to find a place to house the evacuees. They chose a nearly completed commando training camp in sandy scrub at Bob's Farm on the Nelson Bay Road. The camp was not yet occupied and therefore available. Also, the isolation was an advantage, as evacuees with knowledge of Allied operations in Timor were to be kept away from public scrutiny and possible informers. The Army Staff Office at Raymond Terrace provided tents and personnel, including a hygiene sergeant, a butcher and a cook. On Saturday, 9th of January 1943, having travelled by boat, train and truck, the first 100 evacuees arrived, half-clothed, hungry and usually without belongings. Wooden huts with electric lighting, tables and chairs and beds and mattresses were allocated to the priests and nuns and to what the camp commandant called the better class Portuguese. The rest were housed in army tents with a bucket, a basin and a kerosene lamp, and slept on Hessian bags filled with straw. Army rations were generous, but not to the taste of people used to a rice diet. Newcastle organisations, mainly women's, rose to the occasion. The civilian aid services speedily organised clothing and footwear, toys and playing equipment, and comforts like soap. The Red Cross sent crockery and cutlery, fruit juice and condensed milk. By the Sunday afternoon, a 16-bed hospital had been set up and a living room furnished for the Portuguese doctor Elvira Teles, who had helped save the pilot in Timor. Sadly, she was now a widow because the husband, also a doctor, had committed suicide in the colony rather than be captured. The bomb victims' auxiliaries turned up with 5,000 garments, shoes and 3 sewing machines. With lessons from nuns and visitors, 70 women became competent dressmakers. The RAAF Comforts Fund provided material, as well as sweets and fruit for the children, who, it was discovered, did not like chocolate, although they were keen on cordial. St. Vincent de Paul supplied comforts to the nuns, and the Catholic United Services Auxiliary donated necessities so a school could be opened. The priests and nuns gave lessons, and the children quickly grasped some English. For the spiritual side, the priests set up a makeshift church. By 19th of January 1943, 502 evacuees, of whom the army categorised 400 as natives or half-castes, that is, mestizos, had been moved into the hot Spartan camp. The official desire to delineate gradations of race was obvious, but they all had to be registered as aliens. Police from Raymond Terrace attended to take details, signatures if they were literate, and not just fingerprints, also handprints. Each day a medico from a nearby field ambulance unit visited the camp. Private doctors, dentists and eye specialists came as required, many for free. Births and operations took place at the Mater Misericordiae Hospital in Waratah, and some of the deaths. 4-year-old Fernando Neves died from heart failure while under anaesthetic for a surgical operation at the Mater. He was buried, as were other deaths, in the Catholic section of Stockton Cemetery. The officiating minister was Father Edward Jordan from the Stockton Catholic Church. Bill Crothers had been seconded from the Newcastle Milk Board to take over as commandant. Because the camp was so heavily camouflaged, it was extremely difficult to find the track in, so Crothers placed a white painted tin in the fork of a tree to mark the track for the flow of volunteers, suppliers and medical personnel driving up the gravel road to Bob's Farm to help. In February 1943, another 32 evacuated Portuguese deportados were sent to Bob's Farm wearing various items of Australian military uniform. They caused a big stir by visiting Newcastle pubs wearing these items, so they were taken from them. That was just not allowed. On being questioned, a few said that Captain Laidlaw had asked them to join the Australian commandos in Timor, and they had been supplied with rifles, steel helmets, and military paraphernalia. Indeed, 5 of these men then received back payment for having been armed, equipped, and treated as Australian soldiers. At the camp, an Australian Army report described what it labelled the Bob's Farm caste system. The Europeans eat and live apart and do not mix with the natives. Priests and nuns eat and live in their own quarters, but mix more freely with the native population. Natives, half-castes and whites married to natives live and mess together. Class feuds were the order of the day, the report said. One set refused to cook for themselves, another refused to cook for that set. No one would dispose of the kitchen waste. The commandant and hygiene sergeant had to clean the kitchen quarters after dark a few times to preserve what little white prestige still remained. Australians did not like disparities of race. The Portuguese added class to the mix. One camp resident, Custodio Noronha, the judge, advocate and chief of all prisons in Portuguese Timor, was in a difficult position as he had previously sentenced some of the deportados, like Arsenio Felipe, to secondary exile on Ataruro Island off Dili. In Timor, if the deportados passed an official in the street, they had to bow their head. At Bob's Farm, they began asserting they now lived under a democratic government and each and every person must be considered equal. The Army report determined that whilst government officials, deportees and natives are congregated in one community, there will be continual unpleasantness and bitterness. The pressure cooker atmosphere was not just between Portuguese officials and deportados. Vasco Massal was a Chinese-Portuguese mestizo who had killed his girlfriend in Shanghai been tried for the murder in the Portuguese colony of Macau, and imprisoned in Portuguese Timor. After the Japanese invasion, he had escaped prison and joined the Australian commandos, interpreting and cooking for them. Masao was now in charge of the Bob's Farm canteen. A Portuguese bureaucrat complained that Masao gave too much bread to his friends, while the deportados objected to eating in a canteen controlled by a convict and other mestizos. A fight erupted, and the portly José Godinho shouted to the other deportados to arm themselves with knives. One of them yelled out, "Someday I'm going to kill some of these mestizos." Hot-blooded Latin temperament was on display, and Australian military personnel had to step in to defuse the situation. Alongside these tensions, affection developed between many Australians and camp inmates. Army nurse Dorothy Turner had travelled by train from Townsville with one group and recalled, "It didn't take long before we got to know and understand each other, and we learned quite a bit of their language. They told us haltingly of their persecution and hatred of the Japanese. For the most part, they were farming folk," she wrote, dusky, dark-eyed, smallish people with happy, gentle personalities. Children were very dear to them and were everywhere. Indeed, there were 200 children at the camp. Many of the campers used to walk down the hill to the Bob's Farm post office shop run by the Upton family. The Uptons would invite them in for afternoon tea and a sing-song around the piano. They called Mrs. Upton Mother. One of the Portuguese priests would bring some of the boys there to train them in wrestling. The Uptons also had a market garden and let the Timorese take apron loads of pumpkin runners and prince's feather, which the locals thought was a weed, but to the Timorese were cooking ingredients to add to the army rations. A deputation of deportados found their way to the Newcastle Trades Hall in Union Street to send their greetings to the Soviet Red Army on Red Army Day. While there, they asked for help to find employment. The son of one of the Newcastle Trade Union organisers had been a commando in Timor, and while he was on leave, he'd told the secretary of the Newcastle Federated Ironworkers Association about the camp, saying that if it had not been for the people there, the commando's position would have been hopeless. Because of what the commando said, and because the men had been deported from Portugal because of their trade union or political activities, the Trades Hall was keen to help. The president and secretary took two of the deportados and an interpreter to see the federal Labor MP for the Hunter, Rowley James, who in turn wrote to the Prime Minister John Curtin that the government should be able to provide employment for the Portuguese who had assisted the Australian guerrillas in the fight against the Japanese. Curtin contacted the Manpower Directorate in charge of filling labour shortages during the war. The Deputy Director General found a few jobs for the men in a pulp wood plant in Victoria, but said it was difficult because of their lack of English skills. This was before the post-war immigration of thousands of non-English-speaking European refugees and the Australian government becoming more familiar with finding them work. That year, 1943, 20 deportados joined 2,500 Novocastrians to march in the biggest ever Newcastle May Day procession, with 50,000 spectators lining Hunter Street. After the deportados returned to the camp, they were accused of joining the Communist Party by the Commandant Bill Crothers, as though that was a crime, which it wasn't. In September that year, one last batch of evacuees arrived at Bob's Farm, including 8 more deportados and Arsenio Filippi's daughter, Natalina. 2 security staff were embedded in the camp to keep an eye on the deportados' conduct and to log all visitors and car registration numbers. One of the new arrivals teamed up with 2 other deportados to record their memories of pro-fascist Portuguese activities in Timor. Some of those fascists were at the camp, like Francisco Mocinho. However, no one was interested in this information, and Mocinho and his wife were having a disastrous year anyway, with a stillborn baby and their 9-year-old daughter, Evelise, dying from epileptic convulsions on the way to the Mater Hospital. Following more threats of violence at the camp, Crothers requested the removal of the most troublesome deportados, and Arsenio Felipe, Amadeu Neves, and the portly José Godinho were sent to live at the Salvation Army People's Palace in Newcastle and found jobs at Lysart's galvanised iron plant, where, coincidentally, my mother was working, helping make Owen machine guns. But these moves were deemed insufficient. The army decided that 15 of the deportados should be interned because it was considered they would put their own interests before Australia's national security. The 3 men at Lysart's only worked for 2 weeks before they were arrested with 12 others on 23rd of September 1943 and unjustly imprisoned in Liverpool internment camp. They were understandably distressed to be categorised as prisoners of war and to have to wear the same red clothing as the fascist Italian prisoners. Arsenio Felipe believed that the new Portuguese consul, Alvaro Labarino, who he thought was a lackey of the fascist Salazar, was responsible for their arrest. Because of the number of Portuguese now in Australia, Labarino had arrived that month as the first ever official Portuguese consul in Australia, and he did choose to pay his first visit to the Bob's Farm camp on the same day the men were locked up at Liverpool. In contrast, 19 young Timorese men at Bob's Farm were chosen for special operations training at Fraser Island Commando School, and a number of them were returned secretly to Portuguese Timor with 2 Australians to gather information on Japanese troop movements. In December that year, a Christmas party was held at the Bob's Farm camp, organised by the Evacuees Welfare Committee. The secretary, Mrs. Tomlinson, had gathered bags of marbles, rag dolls and toy animals made by the Home Science High School Ladies Auxiliary, and wooden toys made by men from Stockton and Carrington. The community was really embracing the camp. The camp had the dubious honour of being mentioned in a Japanese propaganda broadcast that said Portuguese refugees are housed in canvas tents with no flooring in a concentration camp near Newcastle. Although the tents did have floors, the Portuguese consul was also critical of the conditions and wrote to the Australian authorities that owing to the lack of decent accommodation, poor sanitary conditions and isolation, there were growing signs of despondency and sickness in the camp. He thought the evacuees should be relocated. The Department of Interior had the racist belief that the Portuguese could be housed elsewhere and found employment, but the native and mestizo Timorese would have to stay at Bob's Farm because they could not be integrated into the community. However, the consul managed to re-accommodate all the evacuees in private hotels and boarding houses in Armadale, Narrabri and Glen Innes, and find some of them work. The religious personnel were dispersed into monasteries and convents. On 22nd of March 1944, the last evacuees left the camp. An Upton family member recalled all of a sudden everyone disappeared. 22 evacuees were still living in private accommodation in Newcastle because the men had found employment. Custodio Naronia was working as a clerk at the Dairy Farmers Cooperative, presumably organised by Crothers, formerly of the Milk Board. Stephen Yao, a Singaporean-born mechanic who spoke English well, was employed by Sandeman's bus service at Saltash, and a few men, including the convict Vasco Massal, had jobs at the Masonite factory in Raymond Terrace. The deportados in Liverpool internment camp did not stay there quietly. They wrote letters of complaint, went on hunger strikes, and requested a visit by the International Red Cross. The Newcastle branch of the Boilermakers Society wrote to the Minister for the Army, protesting the internment of anti-fascists who had assisted the Australian Army fight the Japanese. New South Wales Supreme Court Judge Mr. Justice Davidson visited the Liverpool camp and saw proof of the partisanship of at least 5 Portuguese who had recently healed battle wounds, with one man's leg having been riddled with machine gun bullets, probably Alfredo dos Santos. Finally, in March 1944, the Director General of Security decided to release most of the Portuguese internees. To accommodate them and their families, including Arsenio Felipe and his daughter, the Portuguese consul rented Minimbar, a 13-acre fenced property with a 2-storey stone building about 9 kilometres from Singleton in the Hunter Valley. The men were not allowed to leave the property, although some of their wives were permitted to visit Singleton to shop. A member of the security services visited once a week. Their mail was censored, and the local police and shopkeepers were directed to keep a close eye on the residents. The last detained deportados were released to Minimbar in August 1944, bringing Francisco Horta and the young Natalina Felipe into close proximity for the first time since they were in the same evacuation batch a year before. After Japan unconditionally surrendered in August 1945, news filtered out that the Timorese had suffered brutally under the Japanese occupation. There had been torture and killings, burning of villages and crops, and relocation of villages preventing new crops being sown, which caused widespread famine. Many towns had been devastated by Australian and American bombing. So the Australian and Dutch invasion of this tiny country may have been advantageous to the Allies, but as one historian wrote, East Timor was one of the great catastrophes of World War II in terms of relative loss of life. 60,000 Timorese were estimated to have died out of 460,000. Also, because Portugal was neutral in the war, its colony was not eligible for the reconstruction aid that USA gave to Germany and Japan. Australia never offered any compensation. In late October 1945, Monsignor Jamie Goulart, living at a monastery in Pennant Hills, was appointed the first Bishop of Dili by the Pope. When interviewed, Goulart expressed appreciation of the hospitality and assistance he and his people have received from Australia. But, he added, remembering Timor, it has only been hospitality repaid. Bishop Goulart had no grand cathedral to return to. It had been bombed by the Allies. Our government reinstated the White Australia policy, and the evacuees had to be repatriated. Most of the Portuguese deportados applied for permanent residence, but only 2, including Alfredo dos Santos of the injured leg, were allowed to stay. For the others, not only their politics, but also their moral habits were considered not to be conducive to good citizenship. The camp administration had reported that Portuguese men living with native women had been a sore point with local, decent living people. A few other evacuees managed to remain, like the Singaporean Yao family, because the father had a British passport. They built up a market garden at Fullerton Cove and stayed in the region. On 27th of November 1945, a special train brought all the evacuees back to Newcastle to be shipped home. The Upton family, Mrs. Tomlinson from the Evacuees Welfare Committee, Father Edward Jordan, and the Portuguese consul were among the crowd to farewell them. The children, including 70 born during the stay, had koala bears and teddy bears and dolls to take back, and the bigger ones had bottles of Newcastle cordial tucked under each arm. Passports were issued by the Newcastle Customs House. 562 evacuees, at the time the largest number of passengers ever to board a ship in Newcastle, departed from Lee Wharf on the SS Angola, first stop Dili. On board were Arsenio Filippi and his daughter Natalina, the portly Jose Godinho, and Francisco Horta. Some of the deportados, including Horta, were returning to Portugal because their exile had been overturned. Horta later returned to Dili, where he married Natalina Filippi, and in December 1949 they gave birth to Jose Ramos Horta, a prime mover in the struggle for Timorese independence. Jeff Laidlaw returned to his job with Ampol. He took up golf and became captain of Merewether Golf Club from 1950 to 1952. He later became head of Ampol in Victoria. Captain Grant returned to Newcastle to work for the Maritime Board. Now, did the presence of Portuguese Timorese in the district have any significance? The Newcastle Morning Herald regarded the social service work at the Bob's Farm camp as one of the outstanding wartime achievements of local women's organisations. While the Australian authorities retained their suspicion of communists, the Newcastle Trades Hall gave solidarity to the deportados. And despite the racism of the White Australia policy, those who had regular contact with Timorese forged bonds of affection and never forgot them. So perhaps it was one of the cracks leading to the eventual dismantling of the policy. The camp commandant, Bill Crothers, nostalgically went back to Bob's Farm years later and was sad to find all traces of human habitation gone, not even a white painted tin in the fork of a tree. The Warramai Land Council were granted the land, but eventually sold it, and there is now an olive and fig farm there. So it seemed that all that remained were the memories of a few local residents and 8 graves in Stockton Cemetery. But links kept popping up. Retired Army nurse Dorothy Turner's inquiry in 2001 about the camp was the seed for the Port Stephens Family History Society publication. Chance Yeo, who had been a child at the camp and still lives in Newcastle, attended the launch of the book in 2014. I had started my own research on the camp, and former journalist, now historian Greg Ray, sent me some old Newcastle Morning Herald photographs of the camp from his collection. So when Timorese student Graziella Albino came to the University of Newcastle to study and told me her grandfather had been at the camp, we discovered that Antonio Albino, then in his 90s and living in Timor, was in one of the photos. I took Graziella and another Timorese student to the former campsite and to Stockton Cemetery to show them the graves. Graziella was not happy that 7 of them were unmarked. So with the help of Newcastle Men's Shed, all the graves of the young and old people who died while living at the Bob's Farm camp now have wooden crosses with their names and dates of death. In conclusion, although I've called this talk a forgotten story, there are a number of people who are determined that Newcastle's historical links to the brave nation of Timor-Leste are not forgotten.
This story reminds us that history isn't only made on battlefields or in parliamentary chambers. Sometimes it's written in kitchens, post offices and market gardens. The camp at Bob's Farm has long vanished from the landscape. The tents are gone, the gravel road has faded, but the stories remain in graves at Stockton, in quiet photographs, and in the memories of a few who refuse to let this chapter of Newcastle's history be forgotten. An audio-visual version of this podcast is available on our YouTube channel and is based on a presentation given by Dr Conway at our monthly meeting on the 5th of October 2022. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider sharing it, subscribing, or leaving a review. We look forward to you joining us again on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.